Hallelujah, because we are his children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Alleluia. The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 4th chapter. Glory to you. Glory to you, Lord. When evening had come, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great storm of wind arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him, and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care if we perish?" And he awoke, and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" And they were filled with awe, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even wind and sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Grace, peace, and much joy to you, people of God. The boat, which had served as Jesus' pulpit as he taught the crowd in parables, the parables of the kingdom that grows from such small beginnings, but starts to grow as soon as the seed is planted in the earth. That boat, which symbolizes the church, now sails to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. In the boat, some of the disciples are professional fishermen. They shouldn't be afraid of a little squall. But there's an issue, and the issue is faith or fear. So far, all we've heard about faith in Mark's Gospel is that it's the proper response to the proclamation that the time is fulfilled, the kingdom is at hand. The response to this is to repent and believe. Today, we will hear that faith is, in the thought world of Mark's Gospel, one of only two possible orientations towards your whole life: faith or fear. In next Sunday's Gospel, we will hear about saving faith. We will hear that faith saves. But for today, it's the question in Mark's Gospel: faith or fear? It comes up when a squall arises. The Sea of Galilee is very low. It's below sea level, and Mount Hermon, a very high mountain, is not too far away. So the cold air comes down and mixes with the warm air, and you have a storm. And the disciples begin to be afraid. Jesus is asleep on the cushion in the rear of don't say rear, say in the, come on, you seafaring San Diegans. In any event, in the back of the ship, the poop deck. The stern, thank you. You see, it's a group effort. In the stern of the boat, Jesus is asleep on the cushion, and the disciples take his peaceful rest. I mean, you'd want to take a nap after preaching parables all day long. For unconcern. They are wondering, does Jesus care? There's the huge storm. The waves are knocking the boat around. The wind is rising. Doesn't Jesus care? And so they wake him. And he awakes and rises and rebukes the wind and the waves in just the same way that he rebukes the demons. And they obey. And the disciples say, who then is this? Who then is this? So the problem really isn't the storm. The problem is, what's the disciples' relationship to Jesus? They're afraid. They wonder whether he even cares. And with respect to our translators, even after Jesus has stilled the storm, the disciples aren't filled with great awe. They ephebesethan phobon megon. They feared a great fear. It's an even bigger fear than the women at the tomb in Mark 16. There it's just ephedeunto gar, which is a big enough fear. But phobon megon, it's a great fear. Fear or faith? Jesus says, why were you afraid? Have you no faith? And they say, who then is this? This is just the first of 3 boat trips in Mark's gospel. The second one happens right after the feeding of the 5,000, that great miracle of the multiplication of loaves. And in that one, as you'll recall, the disciples are once again going across the Sea of Galilee. The wind is against them. They're having a difficult time rowing. And Jesus comes to them walking on the sea and says, when they see him, take heart, it is I. Do not fear. But Mark, as he narrates the story, says, but they were afraid. And they didn't understand about the loaves. And their hearts were hardened. You know, that seed of the word that causes the kingdom to start to grow, grows and bears fruit in good soil. But in rocky ground, where it can't really take root, it springs up just like it does in the good soil, but then it does not persevere. It's the nature of rocky ground. And rocky ground is a hardened heart. The seed of the word cannot take root in it, and therefore faith cannot grow. Faith comes through hearing, and a hardened heart cannot hold the word that brings this faith. And so, the third boat trip, which comes right after the feeding of the 4,000 and a little argument with the Pharisees. And in this boat trip, Jesus announces to the disciples that they are to beware the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. And the disciples, since they're always very quick to understand exactly what Jesus is talking about, immediately realize that they have forgotten to bring bread and have only 1 loaf, which is not enough for 13 people. But Jesus, of course, as always knowing their thoughts, says, why are you worried about not having any bread? When I broke the bread for the 5,000, how many baskets did you take up? 12. And when I broke the bread for the 4,000, how many baskets of leftovers did you take up? 7. And Jesus says, do you still not understand? Are your hearts hardened? Hearing, having ears, do you not hear? Having eyes, do you not see? Faith comes through hearing. Jesus says in his sermon and parables, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. To the disciples he says, having ears, do you not hear? Are your hearts hardened? Have you still no faith? And the disciples here at the end of this first boat trip, and really throughout, say, who then is this? Can you trust Jesus? If he's asleep on the cushion in the stern of the boat, and you don't know whether he cares. What about long-suffering Job? Here, finally, in the 38th chapter, the thing that Job has been waiting for and asking for happens. God appears to him. He's been bemoaning his sufferings. Why do I suffer? Why do any of us suffer? And Job gets what we Christians, with our 3 articles of the Creed, might call the first article answer. Creation. God says, well, I created all this. And by way of a nod toward the gospel, that the wild, formless power of the sea that represents chaos to ancient peoples and even to us, if we've ever been in a storm at sea, I've restrained that, God says. Part of my ordered creation is that all of that is within bounds. It still exists, but it's within the bounds of my ordered creation. And you can't really fully understand this. God asks Job a whole series of unanswerable questions instead of answering Job's questions. Frustrating to those of us who like to understand things. We will never have perfect understanding. Jesus asked his disciples, do you not yet understand? And Mark says they didn't understand about the loaves. That's a second article answer. They have Jesus in the boat with them. The boat is the symbol of the church. Jesus is there. How come he's not responding to my every request and my every need? Look at St. Paul, the great apostle who wrote about half of the New Testament. In his apologia for his ministry to the Corinthian congregation, he talks about his sufferings, but about how God nevertheless gave the growth in strange and paradoxical ways in the midst of all those difficulties and in spite of all those obstacles that St. Paul's ministry confronted. The kingdom was still growing, still bearing fruit, notwithstanding the obstacles. Once that seed is sown in the earth, and of course we know that Jesus is himself the seed buried in the earth to rise and bear fruit, to rise and rebuke, just like he rebukes the demons, the religious and political leaders of this world, the Pharisees and the Herods. Peace, be still. Here in this strange, paradoxical life of finding by losing, here's where the real power lies. But do we have faith in that, or do we live in fear? That is the question of Mark's gospel. And so maybe a third article answer will help us. If faith comes through hearing, then maybe what we can count on is, as Martin Luther says, the Holy Spirit has called us by the gospel. In the same way that he calls, gathers, enlightens, and sanctifies a whole Christian church on earth. In this Christian church, he forgives my sins. And in this Christian church, I hear the word that brings faith, that opens my hardened heart. And I receive the bread that only Christ can give. In the midst of calamities and hardships and suffering and even persecution for so many in the church, we can have faith that Jesus is present with us, and he does care, and he will rise and break the bread. And even in the face of death, life is overflowing when he breaks the bread. Do we fully understand about the loaves? Are our hearts really open and not hardened? Do we have all perfect faith and no fear? No, of course. But to start thinking that way is to make faith a work, is to make the gospel into a law. Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? Who then is this? He is the one we will very soon confess in that creed. Life is overflowing when he breaks the bread. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.